I think that we can start now. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, because I see some colleagues that are joining us from outside of Europe in different time zones. So my name is Daniela Vintila. I'm the chair of the CCPR Standing Group on Migration Ethnicity, a group that I coordinate together with my colleagues Roberta Perna, Verena Wistaller, Angeliki Constantinidou, and Victoria Finn. We are very, very pleased to welcome you today to this new session of our webinar series, a session that will focus in particular on emigrant voting in homeland elections. Our invited guest today is Eva Østergaard-Nielsen, Professor of Political Science at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. I think all of you by now are very, very familiar with Eva's work. Her research has been very inspiring for many of our standing group members. As you probably know, also Eva is currently coordinating an ERC-funded project entitled Migration and Demographic Diffusion. If I'm not mistaken, Migrademo is the acronym. It's a project that basically tries to examine the impact of migration and democratic participation in origin countries. It's a really fascinating project. So if you want to find out more details about it, I strongly encourage you to have a look at their project website and their social media. And I think if Eva allows me, I will basically leave the information in the chat, the link to your website and the link to your Twitter account. So today, Eva has very kindly agreed to share with us some of the research findings that they have so far in this project. On behalf of the standing group, again, Eva, thanks so much for having accepted this invitation. We said it already, about 30 minutes for the presentation or a little bit more, and then we will open the floor for the questions from the audience. And from all the other participants, let's try to please mute our microphones during the presentation of Eva. And then if you have any questions or comments, you can either write them directly in the chat, and I will read them afterwards, or simply just use the function of raise your hand during the Q&A. So without further ado, Eva, the floor is yours for about half an hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for this kind invitation and this very kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be able to share today some of the work that we're doing in Barcelona on migration and democracy, one could say. So the topic for today is migration, political socialization, and the emigrant vote. And basically the idea is to address the question of what, if anything, changes in migration in terms of the political behavior and outlook of migrants, and how this might lead migrants to be different in terms of political preferences in homeland elections compared to the rest of the voters in the homeland. So I have to emphasize from the beginning and throughout this presentation that everything I say now is comes out of teamwork within the Migrademo team. And in particular for this exercise, the collaboration with Lawrence Go, Nicolas Flies, and Irina Chonet. Oh, wait, there you go. So why the focus on the immigrant vote? Well, there are the numbers. 281 million people live in a country other than their country of birth, a vast increase since 1990. And there's also a vast increase in the number of countries that grant citizens abroad the right to vote from afar. It has increased from 37 countries in 1990 to 135 countries and counting today. But the immigrant vote is not so interesting because of its impact on the outcome on homeland elections. Sorry, I'm missing a whole slide. I'm sorry. It's me. Sorry, can I just start and go back one step? I just wanted to first, before I speak about the vote, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm going to say today. Today we focus on what one could term maybe the individual turn in studies of migrant transnational politics. And what I mean by that is that I've worked on migrant transnational politics for a really long time. And the ongoing debate in the beginning was very much to what extent we were sampling on the dependent variable. That is, we were only studying the interest and participation of migrants in homeland politics when it was manifest, without much concern for the broader patterns of interest and engagement. And basically with what one might term the individual turn, we have now a lot more studies of and a lot more quantitative studies of how migrants think about and act upon their relationship with their country of origin. And this is what makes it really important, I think, to talk about what we can say about migration and political socialization in a transnational perspective. And so what I want to do today is to not talk so much about the Migrademo fieldwork that we're doing in Morocco, Romania, and Turkey, where we are doing surveys and qualitative research on the political elite, civil society, and what we call individual citizens, but instead talk about the work package, which took on a slightly bigger space than initially anticipated because also of the pandemic. This was work that was doable from the office and not in the field, which is the Emigrant Voting Pattern Dataset, EVP, which basically originally comes out of work I did with Irina Chorney on immigrant turnout, but has since then grown in size so that we now have more than 177 elections in the data set with aggregate data on the migrant vote per country of residence in homeland elections. So in the end, I would also like to present some preliminary and some very preliminary findings. So coming back to why to focus on this, it is not, the immigrant vote is not interesting because of its impact on homeland elections. The immigrant vote, I think, is interesting because it speaks to the extent to which representative democracy can deal with mobile citizens. It speaks to the growing phenomenon of overlapping electoral arenas, the literature that's also rapidly growing on parties abroad. And as I've indicated, it speaks to the idea of trying to understand from this angle also how political preferences towards the country of origin change in migration, and how we can try and capture this dual embeddedness of migrants who live in one country and also act politically in another. Which again speaks to the broader debate, which I'll come back to in a minute, of migrants as agents of change, and which speaks to this underlying more theoretical discussion of migration and political socialization and re-socialization. So migration and political socialization is not a new topic for study. Political socialization, if we go all the way back, is the process through which individuals learn their political behavior and establish political orientations, attitudes, beliefs, values related to the political system, going back to the work of Hyman and Easton. And so there is within these studies, without having to do with migration, a debate between whether political socialization relates mainly to early socialization versus lifelong socialization. And in the latter vein, the extent to which political socialization change over time and also may have like a cohort generational effect, also related to exogenous shocks. So a generation experiencing war or financial crisis. And so in this uptake, first generation migrants have been studies as having experienced such a shock. And we have a quite large body of literature that looks again at this idea of whether political socialization of migrants mainly relate to their pre-migration outlook versus a process of re-socialization in their countries of residence. And I've put up some references, and I just want to say that for all the times I've put up references, these are not exhaustive. There are many more and interesting works on this. So within this literature, the conclusions are that what matters is many things. Time spent abroad, how long have migrants been in their country of residence, age at migration, how old were they when they left their country of origin, and also studies that look at country of origin characteristics. Does it matter whether a particular migrant or migrant group come from a more or less democratic background? And we also have studies that look at how this is not just something that happened and then migrants left, but that there is an ongoing relationship with the countries of origin, so transnational ties, and that tries to sort of bring out the understanding of political socialization in the context of the dual embeddedness of many migrants. So in terms of how, let me just see if I can do this properly. In terms of how this translates into relations, in terms of how political socialization in the country of residence translates into the transnational political attitudes, we also have quite a lot of studies of this. On the one hand, one could include studies of the indirect impact of migration on countries of origin. So basically, the studies that, a bit akin to what we're also trying to do in Migrademo, look at how financial and social remittances, understood as the ideas and values that migrants might transmit back to their families and friends at home, how this is influenced by their process of political socializations in their countries of residence. The idea is that there is a growing number of studies with what one could term a control of destination effect, in the sense that it's a comparison between remittances coming from more democratic versus less democratic contexts, and how that has a bearing on the political behavior of families at home. And similar with return migration, the famous work, for instance, of Ruther on the Filipino migrants, where he compares migrants coming back from, I think it's Hong Kong versus Saudi Arabia, and tracing an effect in terms of attitudes to democracy based on this experience. Another set of literature is the growing number of actual survey data at the individual level that we have of voting behaviors of migrants that also include their political preferences in terms of the country of origin. And here we have studies, again, that deal with this idea of whether migrants bring political preferences with them as a suitcase or a backpack, or the extent to which it changes in migration, or the extent to which it's a matter of dual embeddedness, where there's an ongoing influence of both. So for instance, Ahmedou Ansas in 2015 made a nice contribution in terms of showing that voting in Ukrainian elections among Ukrainians abroad there was a highly significant impact of the regional origin of said migrants, sort of indicating bearing influence of country of origin, political socialization. In terms of aggregate data, then we also have a growing number of studies. And here, so the problem with the other two studies, in the first, in terms of the indirect impact of migration, political socialization remains a little bit of a black box. It's something that you measure in terms of its impact on the country of origin, but without really going into detail of what is going on in the country of residence in parts, although not all of the literature. And in terms of survey data, usually the number of countries involved are limited because it's difficult to do surveys across many different political contexts. So enter aggregate data, by which I mean just voting data, collecting data on what all the, say, Turks in Germany voted in the last Turkish election, the Italians in Argentina in the last Italian election, et cetera, et cetera. And here we have studies that try to understand the difference in voting behavior abroad and at home per country of origin. For instance, the work of Tudjun Urbac that show that, and this is mostly based on a European data set, that immigrants tend to vote more for green parties than do voters in their homelands. Also rural parties and far left parties. I think there are several articles on this. And then you also have studies per country of residence, so that compare the vote from, say, Germany versus Argentina in the same homeland election. You have the study of Fitzmul and Doyle, I think it's about Czech and Polish migrants, Cholin on the Tunisians, and Sevianald on the Turkish migrants. And here, the conclusion tend to be that more democratic or more minority rights, the country of residence, this impacts the vote towards the country of origin in terms of the party identity of the choice of the immigrants. And then you have recent studies that also try to capture more the dual embeddedness, locating the immigrant vote also in recent elections in the country of residence, opinion polls, but this is with a more limited number of countries, although it goes back in time. So all this to say that the understanding of migration, political socialization, and the immigrant vote is not a new topic, but each field has its strengths and limitations in terms of depth versus scope. And so in terms of us trying to make a contribution here, we have collected data on immigrant voting patterns in what we hope is a hitherto unseen large number of cases. So basically, this is a data set that has the immigrant vote, like I said, in homeland elections per country of residence. It's hand collected by the Migration team. And so we've surveyed more than 100 countries with immigrant voting rights and ended up having data on 41 countries, because it's not all countries that have this information per country of residence. This depends also on the electoral system and how the data is counted. So some countries like Spain count it directly in the last district of residence of the immigrants, and it merges with the rest of the data, and you cannot sort of pull it out for this type of exercise. We have 92 presidential elections and 85 legislative elections in the data set, and on average we have 4 elections per country. We want to emphasize that this data is not always so straightforward to collect. I give you here an example of a Georgian election slip that was sent to us by the Georgian Electoral Committee. And generally what we have is that we have direct communication or surfing of web pages of electoral commissions, and in a few cases also newspapers, as in this case of Cameroon, in terms of the immigrant votes. So the strength of the data set is, we hope, also the geographical distribution. So it's not just based on the EU or Europe or the West. It has a substantial part based in that, but not only. So we have here a table where we distinguish between number of countries of origin, but also number of elections, because we've gone back in time as much as was possible for each of the cases where we could find data. So in terms of countries of origin, we have 9 EU member states. Then we have what we call non-EU Europe and Central Asia, East Asia and Pacific. We do not have all that many cases. We have Latin American and the Caribbean better represented, and only a few cases from the Middle East and North Africa, and more cases from Sub-Saharan Africa. And again, this reflects also the number of elections. In terms of the countries of residence, again, this is dominated by the EU, but we also have, I think, a fair share of countries of residence across the other regions. And the final number of observations, where each observation is the collective vote from a particular migrant group in a particular country of residence, is 9,710. So here's the map. This is a map where, wait a minute, I can't see it myself now. Blue is where this is where it's a country that's both a country of origin and residence. Yellow is when it's just a country of residence. And pink is when we only have data of this country as a country of origin. So another feature is that what we tried to do was to have a distribution of elections across different types of, different levels of democracy or different types of regimes. And for now, although this is something that we will be working on, we started out working mostly with the polity data set. So we have the categories of autocracy, anocracy, and democracy. If you remember, those of you who are familiar with the data set, it goes from -10 to +10, with autocracy being -10 to -5, anocracy being -5 to 5, and democracy being 5 to 10. And so perhaps not surprisingly, we actually, maybe it's surprising that we do have 2 autocracies as countries of origin. These are Iran and Equatorial Guinea. But this table is to show you actually how many elections in anocracies we also have included. Anocracies are Venezuela, Ukraine, Turkey, Mozambique, Mali, Ecuador, Croatia in 2000, Cote d'Ivoire, and Cameroon. And then, the bulk of the data set is on democracies, but it's worth remembering that this is a category that goes from 5 to 10. So there's also variation within each category, including that of democracies. So, one second to come back up. So I went through the theoretical part a little faster than I wanted, but it's because I wanted also to share with you some of our most recent analysis of this data set. So basically, the main question that we're asking right now is, to what extent, what is the relationship between the political distance between countries of residence and origin and the difference in vote choice abroad and at home? And now some of you may have heard me talk about exactly the same thing 3 years ago in the IMISCO conference. And it's true, this is a question we've been asking for a really long time. But the problem was that in the previous versions, we didn't have all that much data. We didn't have that many country of origin elections. And also we were a little bit stuck in terms of the sophistication of the analysis, in terms of controlling for what is obviously an insane amount of different types of variables that influence this apart from the political distance. So I need to emphasize that we're still working on this. These are ongoing findings. They are the findings that we feel relatively comfortable with sharing, but it's ongoing work. So the dependent variable in what we're doing is the vote difference. So the difference in vote share between the country of residence and origin at year T for the winning party. And this is our measure for how much difference there is, basically. And the independent variable, the main independent variable is what we call political distance, which is the difference between the polity score of the country of residence and origin also in a given year. And it's very important to emphasize that for the first two sets of analysis, this is the absolute value, right? So it's the same whether it's a difference between a country of origin and a country that is less democratic and a country of residence that is more democratic, and vice versa, right? These are absolute values for the first regressions. So I think maybe I stay with this slide. So now that we're working with our postdoc, who's a political economist, we have slides like this with the modeling. But basically what this means is that we have three equations. The first one is, and these are in progression. In the first equation, like I said, we look at the relationship between the polity distance and the vote share difference, and we control for GDP, trade, and corruption. And what's important to highlight, and this is where it's different than the previous versions that I presented some years ago, is that we have year fixed effects. So these are the things and events that are common to all the countries within a year. So for instance, the onset of the pandemic in 2020, if we had elections that were that recent. And then we also have pairwise country of origin and country of residence fixed effects. So these are things that are pairwise specific. So for instance, Turkey-German migration, colonial ties between Morocco and France, and things that are country specific. So if a particular country has a more open or more closed migration policy. But these factors cannot change over time. So that's a limitation to the analysis. So what we cannot control for are the pairwise or country specific times, things that also change. So for instance, if a particular migrant group at the point of leaving left as, say, low-skilled migrants, then if that group changes in migration, as migrant groups tend to do, we cannot capture that. And the second equation, we have we ask if it matters that migrants go from a less to a more democratic country. So maybe it makes more sense if I show you the actual table. So what we have here is 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. And in the first 2 columns, we see that, and again, these are based on absolute value. We see a positive, but not very significant relationship between the polity distance and the vote share difference. But when in the first column, but when we add the fixed effects, then we have a positive and significant relationship. And that means that the more the distance between the country of origin and residence, the more the difference in vote. So something happens in migration. Okay. But it becomes a little bit more interesting in 3 and 4, where we look at the, where we do an interaction. So we see that this result is driven by migrants moving from countries of origin to countries of residence that are more democratic. So yeah. Now, again, these are absolute values, so there is not much direction to this. All it shows is that when there is a difference, there is a difference. And that this difference is more significant when migrants move from less to more democratic countries. So in order to give a bit of direction on this, what we've tried to do is to combine our data set with the V party data set. And I'll just go straight to the table. The V party data set just came out with a new version, and it allows us, it has a fairly global spread as well, and it allows us to link our observations of the winning party in the countries of residence and origin with the codes for the V party data set. And so basically this equation 3, allows us to further understand the relationship we find in equation 2. So basically, this is where it's very preliminary and something that we wanted to share, but it's also a little ambiguous. So basically what you see here, just to say it in words, is that, and here it's not, I'm going to say this is no longer, wait a minute. These are no longer absolute values. So basically what we see here is that in the first highlighted column, among those who go to more democratic destinations, we compare, because we do the interaction, immigrants from countries where the winning party was, and here we've chosen pro-gender equality and pro-welfare. So when migrants go to a more democratic country and the winning party in the country of origin was not pro-welfare and pro-gender equality, migrants actually tend to vote more for that party. Now, this is a finding that is a little bit against the grain of the general literature, right? So the destination effect going from less to more democratic countries also is related to migrants voting more for parties that are not necessarily pro-gender equality and pro-welfare. But then when we do the second interaction, we show that, let me see if I can say this right. When migrants go to more democratic countries and the winning party in their country of origin is more pro-gender equality and pro-welfare, they also tend to vote more for this party than their counterparts in the homeland. And this is a much stronger finding. And so basically the takeaway from this table is that it's not a straightforward picture. It's not that all migrants that go from less democratic to more democratic countries tend to vote only for more sort of pro, say in this case, gender equality or pro more distribution parties. But you do have a more significant effect if the winning party, I mean, the main candidate to vote for is a party that is more in favor of these types of development. So I hope I explained this well. Otherwise, I'm happy to come back to this in the Q&A. So just to come to final remarks, the idea was to say something about how with aggregate data, we could say something about processes of political socialization, resocialization in a transnational uptake. And I think it's important to also point to the limits of this type of data set. So as people who have worked with immigrant vote know, the turnout is often desperately low. So that's an important limitation. And with this type, even with all the fixed effects that we put on this type of analysis, we still have a number of issues that are unaccounted for. Mainly the issue of self-selection is still not something that we have completely dealt with. But I also think that what's important here is that it helps, I mean, the scope also helps us understand the broader patterns of how the vote differs among voters abroad and home, without just looking at migration from the global south to the global north, without just looking at migration that grows from less to more democratic contexts, and to show a little bit also of the complexity in terms of how the immigrant vote reflects different outlook, which isn't just a linear relationship in this respect. So without further ado, and I think I'm just in half an hour, I'll stop here. And of course, if anything was unclear or you have any suggestions, I'm very happy to hear your comments and questions. Thank you.